Hi, everybody. Well, another webcast without a camera, and unfortunately, I wish I was looking at everybody out there, but I'm seeing some guy with white hair and funny glasses on when he's going to read something by Dominic Cannon Clark from England. And he says, I've noticed something and I'm looking for another perspective of what might help bring clarity. When I'm going about my day-to-day business, I can feel my solar plexus and gonad centers intensifying in various situations. And it's clear that when this it is quite clear when this is happening. I would try circulating the energy upward and use a light map, and this would help, though the intensity would come back pretty quickly. I would normally not move energy from the root to the top of the head, as I didn't feel any intensity there at the root. Recently, I've become aware of another level of insecurity and mistrust running in my life, and at the same time, I have started moving my attention from the root area to above the top of my head, even though I don't feel any intensity in the root. While I'm talking, the root center is on pretty strong, Dom. It may be that your root center is on quite strong, but you're so used to it that you're not really aware of it. And this is quite normal, by the way. Nothing negative, just a very normal thing. Now, when I do the exercises for my gonad center and solar plexus up to the top of the head, and I'll talk about that in a second, the intensity softens for longer. Why would I not feel the root the same as the other centers as if it is having such a big impact? So, just what I just said a little while ago about the business of the center being quite strong. It's so strong, in fact, that it's stimulating, and it's stimulated on your left-hand side quite strongly in terms of emotion. But at the same time, it's also in terms of will on that right-hand side. It's getting pretty strong. It's coming up into the chest area and back into the neck area. One thing I would suggest, though, with the solar plexus, that you do redirect it up and through the upper part of the chest, because that will stimulate the throat and help you out a little bit. Draw your attention back and go through the brow center as opposed to going up to the top of the head. What happens when you go through to the front of the brow, the area right here at the top of the head, just past the hairline, starts being stimulated and will activate centers above the head. And it's probably better to do it that way because it will help you to understand things a little bit better, or at least perceive things a little bit better. The other thing that's going up from the gonad center, the gonad center and the root center is really, they're pretty close to being similar, but you have a strong gonad center, and if you move that up in a big curve out and through the neck, out and hold there for about a second or two, then drop it back and move around the back of the neck, out around, big curve, and down into the brow. Once again, energy will move up the brow and across the top of the head, and that will be a little bit more helpful in helping you to realize that root center just a little bit more. It'll stimulate it in a different way, and therefore you'll probably notice it. The one thing I should mention is that when these two centers are functional, 10 chances to 1 the root center is already on, even if you can't perceive it. Because these three centers come together in a fusion. It's very, very valuable to have that happen. When they fuse, and this brings in kind of a question that Mike Brawley was also talking about earlier. When they fuse, it affects the personality, and the personality kind of tries to engage with life from a perspective that is slightly different than the perspective you had before. Every time there is a different level of fusion or a change in one or two or three of those centers at the same time or independently, you have a change in the coming together of those three centers. And those centers are very valuable in surviving the coarser engagement with life on this plane. They are not negative. They are invaluable. They help you to survive. However, also at the same time, not only helping you to survive, but helps you to maintain a focus on how things were before. So you have kind of an increase in the conscious level, helping you to notice what was going on in the unconscious levels as your conscious awareness broadens. Which means automatically you'll say things like, what the heck is going on? I never noticed that before. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? And in truth, these things happened very unconsciously before, and now they're beginning to be more conscious. So you move towards going through a kind of continual process of noting the conscious way of engaging with life, meaning you perceive others slightly differently than you did before, and because you do, there has been an adjustment, almost unconsciously, in how you function and engage with other people. So you're constantly, consciously trying to make sense of things as you open up more. The good thing about that is that you begin to realize that the broadening of your awareness of the unconscious level helps you to reconsider how you normally function in the conscious level, because you perceive things that you never perceived before. Virtually most of the time, people perceive things in their favor. That is a natural, normal way to function. But there's other aspects of that. You may perceive things in your favor, and suddenly you have an insight about something that you're perceiving in one way, and you decide that that may not be as clear as you thought it was in terms of right and wrong. Eventually you get to the point where this right and wrong thing is of less value, and the seeing becomes of more value. Then you begin to notice that your whole life, all the storage bin of your experience, all the teaching that you've had, all the engagement with existence and your survival methods are not negative at all, but you're beginning to move slightly away from how you thought they were so unconsciously or consciously terrific into a place where you're reconsidering them, shifting attitudes, shifting your way of looking at things, because you're becoming deeply involved with a conscious realization that many other people are similar to you, and you're beginning to uncover an aspect of you that is becoming more and more conscious and a little bit wiser in that. It's willing to be patient enough to wait and just consider and reconsider how you've responded or why you've responded, and you engage with a curiosity about people as opposed to an assessment of people. It's a very unusual state. It normally doesn't happen until you become a little bit more conscious. But as you become just a little bit more conscious, that wonderful internal aspect that is there in all of us that has to do with higher levels begins to be slowly vitalized. It begins to stimulate and move a different level of awareness into the conscious aspects of a personality. Seems a little bit complicated. It's really not. I wish I had the board I could write on. I do, it's sitting up there, but I can't move my computer well enough to be able to do that. If I had a couple more hands, I think I could work it out. But I can't quite do that. So I apologize for that. Maybe if you come into, for example, if I'm in Glasgow down and you ask that question, I'll put it on the board and show you how that works. It's really fascinating. I think almost everyone should be interested in that kind of a thing because it makes our relationship with adjustments internally a little bit more real, to see how it actually works in you consciously, but also to note how it is difficult to work in others. And also we have parts of us where that is difficult to do too. Hard to become conscious of something that we believe is the most important way to function, and it's not necessarily the only way to function. And slowly we get to know that, and we begin to realize that we have more compassion for ourselves. We don't regret it, but we do get to the point where we begin to realize that we didn't really know that we were doing what we were doing most of the time. I should say, to be nice, half the time. For some of us, most of the time. That is not a negative way to engage. It's like having a belief system for 50 years. In your case, 30 years. Coming face to face with it and saying, my goodness, you know what? I think differently about that now. And then noticing that it's really okay to do so. But nothing is wrong with the old way of thinking. You're just thinking about something differently than you could before because you've made some inroads into understanding how deeply involved you are with your internal training and how wondrous that your conscious awareness can actually perceive that it's being helped to see differently than it could see before. As this internal growth develops, that last statement gets larger. It doesn't stop us from still engaging with the coarser world reflexively in the manner that we have before, but it enables us to be more reflective and not necessarily agree with how we're functioning in a current moment. We may even interfere with what we're saying and change our minds right in the middle of a conversation. That would be wondrous. That is tremendously helpful because the emotional system is really a sensor, same as the gonad center is a sensor. The root center is also a sensor. And these sensors are highly sensitized to sound, to internal reflexes of an individual, whether they know they have them or not, to an opening so that actually they feed a kind of reflex of awareness in them right through to the brain. And the mind becomes receptive to those reflexes. And then a higher level of mind notes it and says, this is what I'm perceiving. It may be that it means this, but because you're perceiving from yourself, you know that it may mean something other than what you are actually making sense of inside of you. So there are many ways to make sense of things, and moving slowly in the process of broadening out, or so-called spiritual development, you begin to slowly make a different kind of sense of what you are taking in with these internal, deep internal soul sensors, you call them, or chakra sensors, or structures that enable you to perceive flow of force at a very subtle level and make sense of it at a closer, more conscious level, more and more as you go along in your particular development. Each and every one of us are involved with these things, and hopefully we begin to look forward to being sensitized more and dependent upon what we believe has to be true less and less. But that takes a lot of, not only courage, but a lot of internal inquiry without being negative towards the internal self, without only being validated as right or wrong, in other words, but recognizing that we're attempting and hoping to understand things slightly different than what we could when we were younger or living in a coarser world only. Although we don't think we're living in a coarser world, we're all normally engaged with the world that is really just like us, and everybody else is doing the same thing. But gets a little bit tiny lonely, you would probably think, especially if those emotional and will centers are starting to shift, and that reflexive response internally is getting, in terms of your baseline structure and how life was, is getting softer and lighter inside because you're allowing it to show through. Even as we're talking, your root center has calmed down. Even if you're not watching this, it's calmed down because the talking is transmitted based on the centers related to the questions that we're talking about. That's how it tends to work. It's probably something that isn't discussed very often, but it's a valuable thing to discuss these things. Inadvertently, we have to do lots of that ourselves. In other words, softening down, engaging, trying to understand versus trying to judge what's going on. And the emphasis is only on the word of judgment, like assess or make sense of, because in our roles as, from age 0 to age 3 to age 10, teenage years, all the rest of it, and whatever has happened internally, those intense positions related to survival present themselves, and they present with intensity, and a conscious aspect of ours as we develop slowly begins to attempt to soften down that intensity. We tend to soften down from extreme intensity to really soft intensity, or feeling miserable because we're not happy that we're as intense. The trick is there's a whole bridge between that high intensity and the down intensity. We have to learn how to be somewhere in that extremely broad middle ground. And that is a waking zone. It helps us to wake up our awareness to perceiving or seeing what's actually going on, as opposed to describing and assessing what's going on. The seeing is extremely valuable because at the higher level, there is no response, no description, just an engagement. Those engagements are moment to moment to moment to moment to moment, always in that single present. Present shifts to another, then you're in that present, that kind of thing. In our normal world, we're constantly living in the past, anticipating the future based on what we think, based on the past, should be a valuable way to go in life. We have to do some of that because we are creatures that relate to the coarser planes. But at the same time, we're building that bridge so we can link a little bit more with those more subtle planes so that they can come down through that ladder system, chakra system, Zephyra, the system of the Zephyra, fireballs, whatever you want to call them, and come into this realm and adjust even the lower systems so that they can engage more with those subtler planes of mind that don't necessarily agree with what we think mentally or respond to emotionally. But they eventually enable us to see inside almost as an instinct or an intuition, some people call it, or a kind of out of biased position. It's like noting something. Oh, it's windy today. Didn't know it was windy. I was too busy complaining about humidity. Talking about Canada here and today. It's miserable. But it was only miserable because it was humid. Oh, yeah, there was a small wind, which made it a little bit colder than the -12 or whatever it was today. And that made us feel like it was about -18 or -20. Well, some people don't like that, me being one of them. The humidity is the intensity of the emotional dispositional structure. The wind is the movement of that intensity into our expression. When our expression is only running in relationship to how we have functioned in the past and how we can make sense of that and adjust it the best we can with the 8-10% of our conscious awareness of this vast unconscious structure that we have, or that we're a part of, or a universal structure that we're a part of, and then begin slowly to broaden out that conscious structure so we see that we are just involved in those things occurring all the time, and we are perceivers of those things, and we attempt to make sense of them as time goes on. I know that sounds like I'm repeating myself. I'm just trying to shift the metaphor so that maybe it might make a little bit better sense. Sometimes that works. Sometimes it's just the teacher that has a problem with the teaching. All of us try to understand that to the best of our ability. So it's not a matter of being negative towards the understander. The understander is growing sensitivity in the way they hear, in the way they see internally, in the way they perceive that flush and flow of constant energetic engagement that is there whether we perceive it or not. And attempting in one small spark of realization of not about neglect, but about perception, growing and growing so that we can make some sense, little now, bigger later, larger later, and then we perceive that we are that perception, and it is not attached to the body, the emotions, the sight, the hearing, the sensing. It is attached to a knowing that recognizes its existence in a coarser world, in a coarser structure. And we are part of that, and that's part of us. I hope that helps, Tom. I was hoping it was about 2 minutes to 8, but unfortunately it isn't. We didn't get very many questions this time. I always get frustrated with that. So, and my frustration is just, I'd hate to run out of stuff to talk about. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at a whole list of things that Catherine Stewart sent, and I'm just going to see if I can take a look at something. Pardon me for a second. I'll just talk for a few minutes about the problem of the limitations of thought. of the most wonderful things that we have at our disposal, every human being on the planet, although not always do we have these things at our disposal in terms of ability to have material things at our disposal, like books, for example, or listening to people teach, or listening to people talk using dialogue, communication of various sorts, is our intellectual mind. This is a very profoundly valuable piece. It's also a block. So the way I see this thing, and one of Catherine's topics of questions, was looking at the limitations of thought. So the way I see this is that thought is so tightly involved with the system that we have to protect ourselves and survive. But not only ourselves, it's the community we live in, our families, how we've been brought up, the enculturation that we have, what schools we went to, how our environment affected us. You know, we often think that's pretty negative, but boy, it's a schoolhouse. Once we begin to see it differently, we don't always choose to see the same things that we see negative now, negatively. We say, oh my goodness, this is a way that I do not want to be. Or, I didn't know I was being helped in this way. Either did the helper know that they were helping you in that way or another way. It was an old traditional thing that I learned when I was really young. I'm not so sure it really helped me later on, but anyway. I used to look for people, when they did things, I would say, okay, I might have a propensity to do the same things. I do not want to do what they just did. So they taught me how not to do things. Well, I'd like to say, well, and that's the only way I learned. No. Well, it's not really the only way I learned. I was a pretty typical teenager, and I really wish I could have learned everything that was presented to me. But I didn't know what was being presented to me either. I didn't always have a lucidity about what was presented, as almost everyone is caught in the same boat or a similar boat. Then at the same time, you don't realize that when you are growing, when you're younger, you're setting yourself up to act out in the world in a similar fashion to how you're making sense of things. Think about that for a second. So if you're reacting all the time, you will react when you're younger, and you will cultivate some sort of sophistication that relates to reacting as you get older. So if you have a frustration with the authority figures that you are involved with, name a child who doesn't, because we have imperfect teachers. If you ever have been a parent, you will find out you are not perfect either, and you don't know how to parent. But everybody believes they know how to parent when they're parenting, because they're doing the best they can, and that's what they're looking at, the best they can. So when you're doing life, you're living through all of the energetic intensities that you have cultivated from the time of your birth. You're really shaping everything. So you continue to shape. Well, when I got to high school, I should have had a teacher to tell me that, now that's good, you know how to live. You've survived so far. Now, here's what you do from here on in. You begin to reshape how you learned and what you believe is the only way to live. You reshape that and change it and begin to live differently. I know what I would have said about that one. Because many of us, when we're in teenage years, do the no thing, like, and I have to keep saying this, like we did when we were 2 and 3. Although it's much more sophisticated. We don't say it out loud, maybe, we do it inside. We listen, we don't do. This one sticks with us all our lives. It sticks with us only for one reason, because it's in a real weave from the very beginning of our existence. It doesn't mean it's bad. It's clearly what we have to do sometimes when we're engaging with life, is say no to things that may not be helpful to us. But pervasive no's, like a 3-year-old, means everything is not helpful to us, and we are practicing being a parent at 3. So our parents try to figure this out, and they don't know what to do. They're saying things like, what do you do with this person? My God, they won't do this, they won't do that. They're throwing their, that's a one. They're throwing all their food on the floor. You're picking it up. They're training you to pick up their food. And, of course, we don't see it that way. And they get frustrated or whatever they do, depending on what age of education that you have come through. I came through the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, like all the rest of you, and thousands, 2000. So here we sit and we wonder about that. Magically, we don't wonder about that. We don't think it's that significant. But our unconscious is filled with the significance of that in relationship to survival. And we hurt, meaning there is a sensitivity internally which corresponds to a whole overview of our past, an overview of our past, and a single hurt touches the past like a big drum and hits it with a resounding tone. And we respond verbally, facially, intensely to that tone that tells us that hurt. All of those hurts that we've had in our life are tied together. One tiny hurt means a lot to the large hurt because it adds just one more level of stone to that rock that we carry behind us. That kind of thinking. But we don't think that way. It's all unconscious, relating to what we perceive emotionally. Even with some who have come in here with a little bit more activity in the mental side of things, they intellectually negate the individual, and it comes out either by verbal innuendo or it comes out by how they act. But not much thought is given to it. The intellect then is not being used. It's the emotional intellect that's being used to survive, to help themselves to survive that one strand of vibration that affects the coarser vibration, a larger one, and makes it resound internally, and an individual then emotionally responds unconsciously into the conscious, and then things are assessed based on the intensity that resonates towards the reflex to engage and survive in a particular moment. Wow. Yeah. Wow. That may not be as helpful as we think it is. So we begin to broaden out and encourage thinking. Well, so we have schools that encourage thinking. Here's the process of thought. Learn this, and that will help you. And it will, by the way, but learn this, and that will help you. So we memorize it. Write an exam, we got it right. In life, we express what we've memorized from our experience. Unfortunately, there's no exam. There's just expression. Reflexive, and sometimes very characteristically selective. Still, very sophisticated manner of survival of the whole enchilada that we carry with us all the time to engage with life. That is if the real mind is not beginning to function. The real mental structure may be able to see through that and realize that our reflex and our expression is showing the past to the present, ushered in, elevated as valuable and important. Sometimes kindness lives in that, generosity. Sometimes not very much kindness, sometimes not very much generosity. Sometimes very little rethink. But that's normal. That's not negative. But another aspect of mind can allow you to notice when the rethink should be there. And it should be there almost all the time. Now that causes a tremendous problem with the emotional mind. Because if you're going to rethink everything all the time, it's going to make the emotions tired. And they basically are the boss. I hate to say that out loud because everybody thinks they're a mental being. But the emotional, defensive nature of protecting what you believe is true, that's truly emotional. That's not mental. Two mental people meet. Hi there, how are you? I'm good. The world is flat. Oh, that's interesting. I don't really think that's true. It used to be true. A lot of people used to think that way. Oh, really? Flat world mental person. Oh, really? You're kidding. I've never heard that concept. That's interesting. What do you mean? Like oval? No, like a roundy thing. Round, and it goes around and around and around and around and around. Goes through. You even heard it went around the sun. Oh, come on. We're the center of the universe. We all know that. There's a peg through us, and we spin sometimes. But we're in the same place. And everything spins around us. You can look in the night sky, you'll see everything going around us. So we're the center of the universe. The emotional mind of the flat world. But you know something? There's this guy, Cup or something, Copernicus or whatever. And I heard he lives over there. Germany type thing. He's saying that that's not really as true. My gosh, I never heard that. Well, maybe you should think about that. How would that work if that was true? Back into the mental mind. There's no argument there. No protection. No engagement that way. Would that it would be true. Nonetheless, it seems not to work that way, and it seems like we're trained to do it a different way. Legitimately, because there's so much high school debate going on in the whole of the world about a whole bunch of stuff, it's called opinion. It is always tends to come down to a high school debate. Therefore, lots of emotion is involved because you're validating a particular thing as right versus wrong. That isn't a bad thing, but that may be okay in some cases, but we need to move through that a little bit. How could that happen? To allow oneself to think differently about oneself in not a negative way, not a superior way, but just as a person who's trying to make sense of things. And a person that realizes, well, my thought is not complete yet. there's more to it. I don't know what that will be yet. Seems to be a helpful way of reaching into a mental state. Seems to be. So that's really talking about internal personal dialogue with yourself, with honesty. That isn't necessarily related to keeping things just because you thought that way. So sometimes it might be helpful to read outside your boundaries. Read as much as you can. There's a big danger in that, of course. Once you know a whole bunch of stuff, you're much smarter than everybody else. But I said, no. Read as much as you can. You're broadening out what you understand may be current on various subjects, but you don't have to agree with them. But that's what you did when you were in school. But you're an adult now. You don't have to only agree with what you're reading, but it might trigger questions within you that might help you to practice questioning your own book, the book of you, the book that is extremely interesting. You'll never reach the end of it. It's so wondrous. It's universal in nature. Seems interesting if you look at it like that. But drawing an analogy between reading externally and being curious versus using your material to put other people down because they think differently than what you've read, because you read it is not your experience. It's part of your inquiry. Your inquiry isn't complete with an answer, with one answer. In the relationship that we have with our unconscious, it's usually around the idea that our unconscious comes up with a reflexive response, often emotional, but often through the head, so therefore it must be intellectual. That's the way we think. And therefore, it might be probably more true than someone else's response that might be through their head. There isn't anything wrong with any of that. However, to practice preparing to move into a mental structure that can allow itself to look at our intellectual structure internally, our emotional structure internally, our physical structure internally, and note how we function as a personality, which is a composite of all of these things. If you can learn how to practice doing that, you make a pathway for more higher mental perceiving to make its way through us without blocking its entry, because it will change how we allow ourselves to perceive. Mind you, this is only one way of doing it. There are many other ways of doing it. I also happen to believe in the idea of perception in relationship to this idea. Meditation in relationship to this idea. Meditation is kind of making a pathway, slowing down your emotional, dispositional, mental chatter, your emotional responses, also your physical responses, by decreeing to them that this is your meditation time, and no matter what happens in the world, if the world falls apart, you'll still be meditating, because what can you do about it? If you get a phone call, you can always call back. If you are uptight and can't do anything, practice softening down. What a time to do that. Let me know if you ever succeed in those things, because, often none of us can succeed very well. We do our best and hope that the clock gets around until the time is finished. That's a joke. Not a very good one, but nonetheless. You need a sense of humor in the process of preparing for higher engagement. Higher engagement is not for your benefit only. It's not to make you special. You are sitting here in a life. It's only one of them. Wherever you go, that internal aspect of you that is making its way into conscious awareness in the coarser worlds, is attempting to be of service internally to others as well. It's like saying, wow, 1, 10, 50, 100 people who are lit up internally have a tremendous impact on 7 billion. How could this be? Think about it. We have small eyes. They're limited. But my gosh, without them, we are different. This morning I went to get blood check, and there was a guy with a cane. He's newly blind, trying to find his way up a stairs, and he hits the stairs with his cane. And then he's practicing distance in his mind. Okay, my cane's about that long in his mind, and I hit it. Now I have to go 2 steps, and then as he got closer, he felt the step, and now he's on the step, and he moves up the anticipated 2nd step, 3rd step, and then 4th step, and then he's anticipating a 5th one. There's only 4. And then finally, with his cane, he realizes, oh, there's only 4. It's okay. So, I mean, we don't think that. We'll just walk up the stairs, right? So I walk ahead and I open the door for him, and he said, he can feel me. Extra little bit of sense he's cultivating there. He says, oh, thank you. You can hear the door. It's not the senses that he's normally used to. These are new sensing mechanisms he's trying to utilize. I open the 2nd door for him. He walks in. He says, oh, thanks again. He says, boy, some of this is hard to get used to. I said, yeah, I bet you it takes time. I can imagine, but I don't know. He said, now, do you know where the elevator is? And I said, it's on your right, about 10 steps down. So I walked over and I said, I'll punch the up, down the floor. The up, down. I said, can you look after the floor? He said, yeah, they start from the bottom to go to the top, so they go from left to right. These are new senses. He's getting new images in his memory through his engagement with touch, feel, sound, trying to be aware around his body. And the door closes, and he goes, I go downstairs to do my stuff. And I'm thinking, he's attempting to be less blind to the world around him. And we're blind to the world that we engage with. I found that shocking. My God. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. We exist in a tremendously large world, universe. Not only physical. We know very little about it off the physical form. But this physical form is important. It's energized. It has universal flow through it. People would have nobody believe that. That's not real. Emotion is powerful. The development of the mind is critical. And the movement into developing a different sense that relates to these other sensory systems, not only in the etheric body or magnetic body, but in the emotional body and in the mental body. Just because we don't have a lot of information about it doesn't make it so. These are doorways through which energy flows for the purpose of enabling a being on a particular plane to make sense of the plane and that which is out of the plane or beyond this particular plane. To make sense of our past in a constructive manner is very valuable. Not always comfortable, but very valuable. With the help of conscious awareness of those other levels, beginning to really know where these levels truly are, not just through theory, but through perception, is an important piece of our spiritual growth. And Don and Mike, in both of the questions, I wish you well in this one, because it implies that you already are perceiving that those systems off the body, as they register in the body is also a screen. Read it well and be patient and kind and generous and forgiving. I wish you well. Good night, everybody. Thanks for listening.